Good afternoon. I'm Ed Poswoli, president of TrippScott, and with another installation of our webcast series. Today we have Herb London. Herb is president of the London Center, and he's also a board of trustees for BlackRock Funds. He was president of the Hudson Institute, and he was ran for governor and ran for mayor of New York City as a Republican and the governor as conservative. Now, Herb, politics and business have a way of mixing together.
They sure do.
And with this administration now newly elected, Mayor de Blasio now, or Mayor-elect de Blasio in New York City, what's the reaction of the business community of Mayor de Blasio?
Well, again, it's very difficult to describe the entire business community, but I sense a certain kind of uneasiness about de Blasio. A lot of promises have been made, and there's no doubt that what you will see is an increase in taxes. He's already said we have to tax the rich in order to pay for pre-K programs for the young. And the problem with that, of course, is what do you mean by the rich?
Right.
If 1% of the New Yorkers pay roughly half of the taxes that we get in New York City, how much higher can you go before you force these people out of New York? And many in that 1% have mobility. They don't have to stay in New York. They can leave and go elsewhere.
So with means they have choices.
Exactly. And so you've got a real problem. The promises obviously may be well meant, but in the end they could have a terribly deleterious effect on the city. And that is very much in my concern. How do you maintain a tax base in New York? I'm one of those people committed to New York. I love this town. I love New York City. I don't want to be forced out of New York, but I may be the last person here to turn out the lights before we say goodbye. And that is the real worry. The shrinking of the tax base, the changing of the character of the population, the changing demographics in New York make it very difficult to understand how New York sustains itself.
And how from a business aspect, does that create opportunities for states like Florida?
It sure does. I mean, when Perry came here, there was no question. A lot of businessmen
from Texas,
Governor Perry from Texas, when he came to New York and talked about opportunities in Texas, there were a lot of people listening very intently. I mean, think of the advantages that you would have in Florida as well. Homestead Act that you made reference to a little while ago. The very fact that you don't have a state tax and a city tax. You know, city and state taxes in New York combined, 12.9%.
Right.
Now think about this. If they go up to 20%, and a bill passes in the House, which is presently there, so that you cannot deduct your city and state taxes from your federal tax form, that's an effective 20%. If I move to Florida tomorrow, I live rent-free.
Right.
I take 20% of my income, I can put it into an apartment in Palm Beach, live very nicely. So, I mean, you start looking at the arithmetic, you say, what are those advantages in New York? And they may not overcome the tax disadvantages.
And with communications the way they are today, like New York Stock Exchange is going completely digital, as an example. NASDAQ is already there. Is there a real need to physically be in New York City?
It raises a lot of interesting questions.
So moving on, in talking about Florida, Rick Scott, Governor Scott, has spent a great deal of time in trying to attract business. Hertz is one of them, who relocated to Fort Myers area in the southwest section of Florida. Is there, you believe, opportunities for full-size businesses to move down? I mean, Office Depot announced, I think, today that they were considering moving to Florida.
We've entered a very different age. It is the age of service activities. If you had asked me about the future of the American economy, I would say it involves dematerialization of wealth. And what I mean by that is, I can give you a razor, and the razor is not important. It's the blades you buy with the razor.
Right.
I can give you a computer, and the computer is metal. It doesn't make any difference. But what is important are what are the apps that I can buy with that computer. I can give you a telephone. Telephone is meaningless. It is the services that you get with that telephone that count. So we are in a service age. As a consequence, it's what happens in cyberspace that's important, not what happens in the machine shop. And in the age of nanotechnology, you can manufacture anywhere.
Right.
So we are entering a different kind of era. And since it is the dematerialization of wealth, there is no reason why you have to be located in New York. You could be anywhere. And we're going to have 50 states that are competing on the basis of taxes. And unfortunately, the northeast of the United States has a distinct disadvantage. And the reason for that is the power of the unions. We no longer have unions in the private sector. Private sector unions account for 6% of all union membership.
Across
the rest of them are municipal employees.
Right.
And where are those municipal employees? They're in places like New York and Boston. These are cities that cannot survive unless they go through a very significant reformulation of the way in which they conduct their business.
And so a state like Florida, Texas, whatnot, has an advantage of us, so northeastern states.
Without any question. Without any question.
Right to work?
And that's the real problem, by the way, when you talk about the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party is basically a Southern party. But in order to generate votes in the North, it has to make accommodations with the unions and with big government. So it's not a Republican Party, it's a rhino party. Republicans in name only. And that is one of the difficulties that you have. You have a schism within the Republican Party based on the changing economic conditions in the country.
And we're seeing it down in Florida now. And we're seeing it everywhere, pretty much. I mean, the rise of Chris Christie, as an example. I mean, do you believe that schism can be driven together? Like, as an example,
there are a lot of
the enemy of the enemy of my enemy is now my friend, in a certain sense. So we have, even though rhinos, as you described, say northeastern accommodations that are made to essentially a Southern party, can we do that and put together 50% of the electorate?
I say we, Republicans, have to overcome the basic fracturing within the party. And there's all kinds of fracturing. There's ideological fracturing. There is the accommodationists within the party who want to make deals with the unions. There are the people who stand on principle, even if it undermines the character or reputation of the party. And of course, there are the libertarians who are perfectly willing to return to 1955 and a Robert Taft view of foreign policy. There are problems within the Republican Party, but that isn't to suggest the Democrats don't have problems of their own.
Right.
The key is, can we keep the party together for 2014, that is the off-year elections, and for 2016 in the presidential election? I believe that people are starting to come to their senses about the need for cohesion within the party.
Do you see that ultimately resulting, is it because of the things that the Republican Party is trying to mend itself, or is it the galvanizing forces of what they think of Obamacare, or what they think of the impingement of freedoms that the Obama administration and other Democrats are now preaching?
The leading element in the success of the Republican Party is the failed policies of the Democrats. Obamacare has galvanized Republicans in a way that was not possible roughly 2 years ago. It's a very different ballgame. All you had to do is look at the Cuccinelli election or failure in Virginia.
Right.
He was 15 points behind, 2 weeks going into the election, 15 points behind, 2 weeks before the end of the election, and he was 15 points behind. How did he catch up so quickly? Hammering away at Obamacare. Obamacare. You can't select your doctor, even though the president said you could.
Right.
You can't select your hospital, even though the president said you could. You want to get an exchange program? You can't. So all of the things that were said proved to be lies. And now the public is finally, even Democrats have come to an awareness of this. So it is the failures of the Democratic Party that I think bring Republicans together. It's very difficult for Republicans to bring themselves together. Christie already said, I don't see the world the way Rand Paul does. Well, I don't care whether he does or not. The fact is that Rand Paul and Christie are two Republicans. They're going to have to find a way to see eye to eye with one another. The Democrats did this in the 1930s, where you had the Dixiecrats, made Harry Truman very uncomfortable, but he found a way to keep the Dixiecrats in the Democratic Party. We're going to have to find a way of keeping the Libertarians in the Republican Party.
Interesting. The issue around Obamacare, though, appears, put aside the website and put aside the technicalities of the law itself, it seems to me that there is a galvanizing force around the impacts on people's choice, the ability to choose. I mean, that seems to me to be a winning argument.
The overarching issue in the United States today is personal liberty. Whatever you think of the Tea Party grew out of a grassroots movement to look at the insidious quality of government expansion. And they're saying, look, we don't want to live in a society where the government is so intrusive, so involved in our lives. And this is true when it comes to Obamacare. You start looking at Obamacare, you say, suppose I'm 90 years old. I need a feeding tube. Will I be able to get one? I was told very recently by someone who needed a knee transplant that she was only 45 years old. And they said that would mean 2 in a lifetime. So you're not ready for it. So you're starting to see people's personal choices restricted by the way in which hospitals are obliged to operate. And that has something to do with the funding that is coming through the federal government. And so the consequence of this is a lot of very unhappy people. There are things you can say to Americans, but saying to them, I'm sorry, you can't select your doctor any longer, that goes beyond the pale. That is something that is clearly unacceptable. And that, I think, is one of the ways in which Republicans can make inroads into what are normally Democratic areas.
Herb, our time is about up, and I did want to take an opportunity to thank you again. We very much enjoyed speaking with you today, both about some economic issues, Florida, New York, as well as we touched on Obamacare. Thank you so much.
Thank you.